Perfect. So welcome everybody to the Psychedelic Society. It was formerly the Vancouver Psychedelics meetup. We've changed our name recently, but it's the same great group. My name is Christoph. I'm the founder. And for those of you that are here from the Vancouver Mycological Society, I want to extend to you guys a warm welcome and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. Today, we're going to have an exciting speaker for our 24th meetup. It's Paul Kroeger. He's an expert mycologist with over 45 years of experience. He's going to be talking about fungi and mushrooms, and I'm going to do a little introduction for him shortly. First, I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous territory, and we want to sort of acknowledge their kinship and commemorate their kinship with the land. And it is a beautiful land we inhabit. It's abundant and it's breathtaking and absolutely beautiful, and it's just a microcosm of hidden and not so hidden gems. In fact, a lot of people underestimate just what a variety of fungi and macrofungi exist in our province, not to mention some of the magical kind. So it's an exciting, captivating, and mysterious and spectacular world of mushrooms and fungi, and we're looking forward to exploring more with Paul as he opens the door for us. And I know Paul's got a full and packed presentation, so we're looking forward to that. And we'll get right to it. I have a couple of announcements I want to make real quick, and then we'll bring it right back to Paul. So firstly, I just want to mention that after Paul's talk, we're going to have a Q&A session. So this is the point where you can just save your questions for there, and then you can ask them directly to Paul, and then he'll be happy to answer them for you. After this, we're going to take a brief little intermission, and then we're going to split on into smaller groups for our meetup breakout sessions, which is where we break up into groups of 6 or so, and it's a chance to really connect with people, get to know the people around you, and it's a chance to keep that dialogue going. It's something we really recommend. It's a lot of fun for those who do it, and we really recommend you guys stick around for that last part as well. If you're only here for the talk, again, thank you for joining us for that as well. Also want to mention, with our rebranding, we've created a new logo, which we've been very pleased with. It's been a bit of it's a piece of art, and it's something I think really well embodies and represents sort of what our group is and what our society has grown to be. And we're wondering if, for those of you who are able to help with any donations, just to help support and share some of that cost, we greatly appreciate any support you're able to give. There is a link for donations at the very bottom of the meetup page. There's an e-transfer link. So again, we appreciate any support that you have. So thank you for that. As well, I want to mention that we do have a chat. So this is a big group chat, and it's like where all the community comes together to kind of keep this conversation going. We talk about psychedelics, sharing our experiences. It's a place where people can be very vulnerable and open up, really ask questions, and sort of get to know the community. It's also where we organize a lot of other hangouts and like events and things like that, especially once COVID kind of gets on to the winding down part of it, then we'll be doing more actual physical stuff as well. So again, it's a place I really recommend that you guys do join. And if you are interested in that, please send me a message on meetup.com. There's a messaging platform in it, so you can just shoot me a message. Make sure you have your number in the message, as well as the Telegram app downloaded, and we can get you in there. As well, I want to mention that we're going to be transitioning to our Discord server. I know I promised this a little while ago. We've been a little bit delayed, but we are going to be moving on with that. We've got a couple of volunteers already, and we're looking for a few more volunteers just to help with our beta test. So if that's something you're interested in, please shoot me a message in the group chat, and then we can kind of get into that and get that rolling. As well, I want to mention that our next meetup is up. So on April 17th, that's a Saturday at 2 p.m., we're going to be joined by Dr. Kwasi Adusi. He's a mental health nurse practitioner, as well as the founder of the Psychedelic Society of Western New York. So we're very excited to have him. He's going to be talking about harm reduction, especially in the context of today's growing rapid psychedelic use and how it relates to the communities and society as a whole. And he's got some really cool stuff to bring. So really looking forward to having you guys join us with that. Again, the meetup page, event page for that will be launched by tomorrow. So look for that in an email. Looking forward to seeing you guys there. And finally, I want to pass it on to Ken. So Ken is our group moderator, and he's one of the group leaders and community organizers, and he's going to be talking about the code of conduct. But before I pass it on to Ken, I do want to just give a shout out to Ken for everything that he's done and for being part of this community. He's actually been here literally since day one, and he's done so much for us. He's been a bit of a backbone to the community in terms of being there, helping with all the events, and just helping organize things and being there with the community. So I really want to give you this thank you, Ken. And again, we're blessed to have you and to have you as a friend. So thank you.
Well, I'm now blushing, Christoph. Thank you very much for that.
That was the
Now I
that was
need to
the point.
speak to everyone while I'm embarrassed, but thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I just moved, I just moved here like 2 years ago, and you guys have become my friends. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, so as we get started here, thanks again all for joining. The first thing I'll mention, if you didn't notice, we are recording this event. So if you are concerned about privacy, you can do a few different things. We'll do our best. We do our best with privacy, but it's kind of a best effort. You can change your name in Zoom. There's buttons you can figure out to change your name in there. If you want to remove your last name or put in a fake name, you can disable your video. If you're asking questions, you can ask in the chat, and for the Q&A section, you can mention to me if you want a question that you wanted to be asked anonymously, and I won't mention your name. And I can't give everyone a Zoom lesson here on the spot, but Zoom has a pretty good website for help if you need a hand figuring it out for your phone or for your computer or whatever you got. So please give it a go. Really, the only thing you really need to know about is how to do chat and for questions, or how to raise your hand to ask a question during the QA session. Please do mute when not talking. The default is to mute everybody, but you do have the ability to unmute yourself. But in general, please only do that if it's your shot to ask a question. And then, like I said, when in the end, you got 45 minutes or so to figure out how to do the raise hand button, which will be nice if you want to ask a question to Paul at the end. Let's see, right after the talk and before the Q&A session, we will be taking a few minutes break to, a bio break or to get a drink or whatever. So in between the talk and the QA, normally we do it after the QA, but Paul's requested we're gonna do it after his talk and before the QA. So just plan on that. You get a few minutes to use the restroom and do whatever else you need. And then we'll go into our, our breakout sessions, which can go as long as y'all want. We've got some real marathon talkers out there. Again, in the break, when it comes to the breakouts, again, we'll have like 6 to 8 people in those breakout discussions. You can talk about anything you want, this topic, anything related to psychedelics. Please just be nice to each other, be respectful of each other. We've had pretty good luck so far, so let's please keep that roll going. And the last thing I'll mention, if you have any issues with your Wi-Fi connection, the Zoom does have an ability to call you. You can leave computer audio and then actually have it call you on a plain telephone kind of way, which can be more reliable for the audio connection. So before I hand it back, I just wanted to mention one thing. We're trying to get into this new app called Clubhouse. I don't know if anyone out there is familiar with it, but Anna and I have just decided kind of on a whim to do a Clubhouse conversation tomorrow, 7 p.m. PST. So we'll definitely be talking about it at we'll definitely remind everyone in our chat room and Telegram that we're doing that. But if you can find us on Clubhouse, we're just going to do like just a random psychedelic Q&A session on kind of anything. So we're just going to try that out and see how it goes. I've only gone on there a few times, so it'll be fun. So it's tomorrow, Monday, the 28th at 7 p.m. Pacific time. So hopefully see you there. So again, thanks for joining. If you have any questions, ask in the chat. And yeah, we'll be talking to you. So Christoph, I'll hand it back for you to get things started.
Awesome. Thanks so much for going through that, Ken. So for many of you actually here do not even need an introduction to Paul. But for those of you who are just meeting for the first time, Paul is the founding president of the Vancouver Mycological Society. He has worked at the University of British Columbia researching the biochemistry of medicinal mushrooms and has been a research associate of the UBC Department of Botany for many years. Paul has published with many other mycologists as well as contributed significant collections to DAOM Herbarium in Ottawa and DAVFP Herbarium in Victoria, as well as a regular consultant for various poison information centers and agencies. Paul will be giving a presentation on the history of psilocybin mushrooms with a special focus on BC. He will be exploring their ancient use, their rediscovery in Mexico in the mid-20th century, and their early role in the counterculture and the continuation of legacy into the present day. Paul will touch on their mixed impact on modern society, why they became prohibited, and their values as medicine. So again, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. We're so appreciative of you being here, and we're looking forward to your presentation. So thank you.
All right, yes, Tionanacatl is the Mazatec name for the sacred mushrooms. This is discussing their history, especially in BC, and I hope you enjoy it. We know that there was ancient use of these entheogens dating way back to many centuries before the Common Era. Some artifacts date back to 800 BC in Central America. This is a pre-conquest Aztec manuscript showing various deities holding pairs of mushrooms. This is an example of the sort of clues that eventually led to the rediscovery of these. Post-conquest, many of the native practitioners were converted to Christianity, and the scribes were tasked to portray the life ways of their people. And here we have a portrayal of the ingestion of the sacred mushrooms by an Aztec healer. And in the Aztec culture, green was the color of sacred, color of jade annotated something that is sacred. So the traumatic devastation of the Aztec and other cultures following the Spanish Inquisition drove the traditional practices underground, where they carried on in secret until this past century, when R. Gordon Wasson, a vice president of JP Morgan Bank, became an avid ethnomycologist. He and his wife Valentina got very intrigued by their differing attitudes towards mushrooms. She Russian, he of British American extraction. He feared mushrooms, she loved them. So this got them launched into the study of human relations to fungi. And he heard about this ancient use of the mushrooms, evidence showing up in the archaeological record and in the written record of the few codices surviving the conquest. So they went to Mexico and managed to track down a curandera who in the town of Huatla in Oaxaca. And in 1955, they ingested the hallucinogenic fungi, the first outsiders that we know of to have done so, in a healing ceremony, 1955. And out of this ceremony, they produced a nice pictorial article for Life magazine, which is what launched the whole subject onto the world and intrigued many people. They attended the velada, which was held for healing. There is a young man who was direly sick. The ceremony was held at night in the dark, in secret. Mushrooms gathered, blessed over copal incense smoke. And Maria Sabina, the curandera, led the ceremony for several hours. It was taped, it was recorded, audio tape. It was photographed, and it was recorded on movie camera, documenting the entire ceremony. And the mushrooms were handed out in pairs, symbolic of the dualities of life and existence, night, day, moon, sun, evil, good, binary and non-binary, etc. And it proceeded with chanting in the Mazatec language, a dialect of the Aztec, the Nahuatl language, and is very emotional and a very impressive piece of recorded ethnological research. Now, Wasson was well connected financially and intellectually, and had skills as a writer. He trained as a journalist before sinking to banking. And he was able to enlist the aid of Roger M. with the Natural History Museum in Paris. And they scoured the hills around Huatla and other parts of Mexico, seeking out the mushrooms used traditionally, the vast majority of which were new to science, and they named them in honor of the various peoples and areas of Mexico, and published a beautiful series of works documenting all of this. And these are some of the Psilocybin mexicana. The Zapotecorum was named for the Zapotec people. There was Aztecorum, Mazaticorum, etc. They also enlisted the aid of a chemist, Albert Hofmann, who's most famous now for having discovered and being the first person to use LSD, a compound derived from alkaloids that exist in the grass parasite ergot, or Claviceps purpurea. So he was able to identify, synthesize, and recognize the importance of hallucinogens. So he was sent the mushrooms, probably the only lab in the world at the time that was really qualified and equipped to explore in depth the chemistry of the sacred mushrooms. And he was able to identify psilocybin, 4-phosphoryloxydimethyltryptamine, and its relatives as being the active components in the mushrooms. With these diagrams, I like to suggest that a diagram on the left is before the psilocybin, and the one on the right is after. And they're able to figure out synthesis procedures, so they were able to synthesize it and make it available to the psychiatric research community. And it was distributed to various researchers around the world. It was considered to be an extremely potentially powerful neurological research item, mostly based on the idea that therapists could take the drug themselves or with somebody and experience the sort of altered states that are characteristic of the treatments that they're trying to treat or to remedy. And they published a monumental couple of works out of all this research that stand to this day as one of the most extensive and detailed studies of a newly recognized, to the scientific world, agent used by humans. 1958, that was published. Now, a lot of speculation has arisen from the result of all of this, that the mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, may have played a role in many different cultures. And we have tantalizing clues from different cultures, including this Tassili Plateau in Algeria, rock art that appears to show the bee god with mushroom imagery. And all of this led to Wasson being commemorized in postage stamps by the country of Togo, which is quite an odd accomplishment. Now, it attracted a lot of attention, psychiatric community, as academics in general. One of these people was a professor, psychology professor, Timothy Leary, and he got his first trip, 1961, in this particular villa in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And he was most impressed. He came back to Harvard, initiated studies using them as therapeutics in repeat offending criminals and chronic alcoholics, etc., drug addicts, etc. Had very promising results from that. And then he discovered LSD that was circulating around the academic community and got totally sidetracked into LSD. Became quite sensational and promoting of willy-nilly use of hallucinogens, and became a major mouthpiece for the psychedelic revolution, which happened to coincide with a time when there was probably shared cultural traumatic stress, disease after 2 world wars, and all that had happened in the first half of the 20th century. Out of this sprang a journal, the Psychedelic Review, starting in 1963, and documenting some very impressive research on use of hallucinogens and various aspects of these psychedelics. Now, it's very interesting that it appears that Vancouver, and UBC specifically, was a spark in the psychedelics movement, because we have the first documented intentional use of hallucinogenic mushrooms growing outside of Mexico. And in Vancouver in 1964, students at UBC were noted to be eating these mushrooms. And Bob Bandoni, the mycologist, obtained specimens which he sent to Alexander Smith, the leading American mycologist at the time in Michigan. And he received the mushrooms and identified them as Psilocybe semilanceata, misspelling it semilanceolata. And specimens are still tucked away in the Michigan Herbarium of these that were collected in 1964. In the spring of 65, they received word that these were the hallucinogenic mushrooms. They've been analyzed, found to contain psilocybin. Here's a letter from a chemist at the in Washington State, and he analyzed them. He here describes the extraction and analysis technique that he used. And then he expresses doubt because he said that so far the psilocybin had only been found in other species of psilocybe, and but simultaneously specimens have been sent to Paris to Roger M at the National Museum of Natural History, and he worked with chemists to do their own identification of the active compound and confirmed that it was psilocybin that was in this. So this is a publication headline and introduction from the Journal of Forensic Sciences describing the result. And it says here, a sample of mushrooms seized by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Vancouver. Now it was UBC students that had been experimenting them. Now, simultaneous with all the interest and with Timothy Leary's great enthusiasm for this, there's a whole community, mostly starting in the academic sector, that were very enthused about the intentional use of these mushrooms in a non-clinical, non-therapeutic style, more of a personal exploration. And so there was a group of them who published this book, The Psychedelic Guide to Preparation of the Eucharist, and a few of its many guises, blah, 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 goes on and on. This is the Neo-American Church League for Spiritual Development, an ultimate authority of the clear light. And so there's this rather quaint book that they published, and it had recipes for making all sorts of these psychedelics that were known at the time. At the same time, there is great interest in the general public, people not from the academic community, and the magic mushrooms began to spread in popularity. And there was an explosion of interest in the late 60s into the 70s, largely funded by a cultural phenomenon that had to do with the deterioration of the counterculture, somewhat characterized by what happened at Altamont, where the Hells Angels were violent at a Rolling Stones concert, and it sort of fractured the hippie counterculture scene, which at the time had been very welcoming of everybody. As a result, methamphetamine, heroin, various synthetic drugs were circulating widely. Motorcycle gangs and other parties were getting involved in a big way, and a lot of violence and negative things began to occur, including poisonous drug supplies. This may all sound somewhat familiar, by the way, in the present world too. And there is a great movement away from synthetic drugs. People were much more interested in natural source hallucinogens and other intoxicants. So because of this great interest, there began to be a bit of a flourishing scene. So a couple of books that were important. A Key to the American Psilocybin Mushroom was the first popular little mushroom guide for identifying the magic mushrooms. And then Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide was the first really comprehensive, really workable book instructing people how to grow their own magic mushrooms. Launching Psilocybe cubensis is the most widely consumed mushroom around the world at the present time. And at that time, it was ever gaining in popularity. And many people that got enthused about growing their own later turned into serious mushroom growers of edibles and medicinals and other things. And there was a great variety and diversity of little mushroom guides that were coming out at the time. And the mushrooms were so popular that there were festivals. There were it was in the mainstream press. Everybody was aware of them. Here's from the Georgia Strait, Fat Freddy's cat and his friends go mushroom picking. And there's a little, the bottom right has, I don't trust anything that grows out of cow flop. I don't trust anything that doesn't come in a nice clean gelatin capsule. And that was the sort of, there was a dichotomy at the time of those that like the synthetics and MDA and all of those sorts of things, and the people that were seeking the peyote and the mushrooms, etc. They wanted the natural source drugs. And the cultivation didn't always turn out well. Now, Canada was a bit of a hotbed, British Columbia and Vancouver especially. It became quite high profile. There were a lot of odd deeds done and strange results from a lot of people having access to the magic mushrooms and eating them. And sometimes there were psychiatric implications of people that weren't prepared or not understanding the potential consequences of the hallucinogenic experience. The psilocybin under pressure from various sources was added to the Food and Drug Act in 1974. Then in Haida Gwaii in 1978, mushrooms were confiscated from a member of the Massac community. And her defense lawyers said that she was not possessing the chemical psilocybin. All she had was mushrooms. Mushrooms are not a chemical, they're just mushrooms. And the BC courts agreed that her intention wasn't to possess psilocybin, the chemical. She was picking magic mushrooms, which are something else that just happened to contain this restricted substance. So from 1979, and then the government on appeal lost the appeal. And so from 79 to 82, the mushrooms were technically legal in British Columbia and Canada, across Canada. Then in 1982, they were basically ruled illegal again following a seizure, a bust in Duncan, BC, where a man had offered a pound of dried Psilocybe simulantiata, Liberty caps, to an undercover narc, calling them psilocybin mushrooms and wanting something like $1,200 for them. And the judge in that case decided, he had offered them as psilocybin mushrooms, stating that it was the chemical within them that he was selling. The price of £1,200 or whatever a pound indicated that he wasn't just selling dried mushrooms, but was actually selling a drug. And that drying the mushrooms constitutes processing of a natural product, turning it into what can be considered a drug. So from 1982 until present, the mushrooms have been technically illegal to possess, fresh, dried, or in ground up, powdered, whatever form. The mushrooms are considered illegal to this day. There was a whole saga of this magic mushrooms in Canada and BC. And these are some of the headlines that started in 1970. Mind-popping fungi sought in Richmond, when the public were just beginning to find out about the use of these mushrooms. And 1979, the court ruling came down. Doctor wants possession of magic mushrooms ruled illegal. RCMP losers on mushrooms. Pastures leased to mushroom folk. There were farmers that were making a quick dime on the side by charging admission, operating magic mushroom U-pick in their fields. And then there was a lot of conflict. There were communities that were terribly disrupted by great influx of commercial magic mushroom pickers, often from elsewhere. And there was what they called the mushroom wars that ended up in violence, where locals surrounded mushroom picking camps. And then in 1982, the ruling against the mushrooms came down. And here we have 1983, no magic. I must say that just about all of this use was strictly recreational, casual use. We're not talking here about serious therapeutic, remedial, or spiritual use. Much of it was casual, recreational. In this fall, in the Fraser Valley, central Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii, and elsewhere, mushroom season would be a lively time. And you'd see people out in the pastures picking the liberty caps. At the same time, there were magic mushrooms popping up all over the urban environment, all through Vancouver, Victoria, other towns on the coast. There were magic mushrooms in landscaping. Several species grew as weeds all through the urban environment. The publications like the Georgia Straight would have annual mushroom special issues celebrating the arrival of magic mushroom season. And in 1979, after the mushrooms had been ruled as not illegal, a group of brothers and other people from Vancouver Island founded the Fane of the Psilocybe Mushroom Association, which was a religious organization that declared the magic mushroom as their official sacrament. And here's the constitution. And the arrowed item is to disseminate the fact that all mushrooms of the genus Psilocybe are sacraments, and that their ingestion is an aid to enlightenment and a religious practice, therefore protected by the Canadian Bill of Rights under the Freedom of Religion Clause. The vast majority of use of these mushrooms, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in North America were at least experimenting with the sacred mushrooms, with the psilocybe mushrooms. The vast majority of the use was recreational, casual, but many people out of their experiences began to recognize great spiritual self-improvement and self-enriching aspects of the experience. And many of the initial recreational users became quite devoted, serious, and very intentful advocates of the use of hallucinogens for betterment, personal betterment, without the casual recreational hazards of lack of quality control and lack of regard for set and setting. Things tended to become spontaneously ritualized to some degree. One of the brothers of the founders of the Fane was a gifted painter, and he loved to try to portray the effects of the mushrooms in his paintings. So here you have the Pontillist type splashes of color and enhancement of contrast, and the emerging from random patterns, or these swirly patterns that many of us are familiar with, and led to him lying on his back on a Gulf island, staring up at the snow and having a great time. And so the mushrooms are very enriching for the artistic community, as well as of great interest to the academic community. And here I'm just going to run through a few of our magic mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, with just very brief notes about them. And Psilocybe azurescens originated in Astoria, Washington, at the mouth of the Columbia River in beach grasses, and was brought back here and cultivated. Grows quite readily on wood chips, and it has escaped domestication and now grows spontaneously in parts of BC. Psilocybe baeocystis was a major weed mushroom in the late 60s, early 70s into the early 80s, and grew out of bark mulch, old growth Douglas fir bark that was used as mulch and landscaping material. It has virtually disappeared now from the urban environment. And a characteristic that it has that most of the hallucinogenic mushrooms have is the blue staining that's a result of oxidization of the active component psilocybin psilocin, producing this blue pigment. People used to believe that by making the mushrooms go very deep blue, they'd be more powerful. They're actually encouraging the breakdown of the active ingredients. And so ingesting these battered, abused, and aged mushrooms would lead to disappointment or even belly aches from contamination. So the less bluing is actually on the mushrooms that you're ingesting, the less the active ingredients are broken down. The deeper the bluing in the type of mushroom, then the more potent it is likely to be. Psilocybe cyanescens, the wavy cap, is very familiar. It's still quite a common mushroom, very potent. That and the two previous azurescens and baeocystis are infamous for being extremely potent, high levels of psilocybin psilocin. Also baeocystin and norbaeocystin are in there. And they all three have an odd property of causing a symptom that the other psilocybin mushrooms don't usually cause, which is the inability to walk, ataxia, rubbery knees. It's no problem. It's just something we don't know why. And it's something which is good to note if you get into cyanescens or one of these other very potent ones. Don't be panicked if your legs don't work. You haven't had a stroke. It's just what happens with these three species. And they can grow to be quite a size. They grow on wood chips, so they can be incorporated into landscaping. And in an environment where the mushrooms are still illegal, it can be nice to have a domestic source, discreet, where, and this is a nice organic veggie garden where the pathways between the raised beds have wood chips and produce nice crops of wavy cap. Psilocybe cyanofibrillosa is a fairly uncommon one. Most of these mushrooms are considered to be weed mushrooms, and some of them probably introduced with Europeans. So Semilanceata, the Liberty cap, was probably brought in with European cattle, and other livestock, and forage grasses that were brought over from Europe, and probably the mushroom came with them. The other ones like azurescens, cyanescens, baeocystis, and most of the others are associated with human-created habitat. So one exception is cyanofibrillosa, which is found growing out of tree roots in wild rivers in the volcanic valley of the Lillooet River. And this is the habitat, a flood-prone, very dangerous riparian area that's regularly washed over by high floods, etc. And this characteristic little mushroom is probably a native species that grew in such wild country habitat, and then was somehow introduced into landscaping materials. That's probably what happened with all those other species. The cyanescens and baeocystis probably were rare in nature. This is a European species, Psilocybe trinitaria, that appears to have been brought over with fodder grasses and livestock, and it periodically shows up in Liberty Cap Field, has a little ring, a veil on the stem, and is quite characteristic. Psilocybe pelliculosa grows in woodland. It's a little brown mushroom, very low potency. It's not recommended. Little brown mushrooms are infamously difficult to identify. There are many things that look like this, and the number of these that you would need to get an effect would mean that if you got the wrong mushroom, you could get serious negative effects. Semilanceata, Psilocybe semilanceata, the Liberty cap, was the iconic BC magic mushroom. We've had a proposal for a few years to designate a provincial mushroom for British Columbia. Many people think it should be the Liberty cap or Psilocybin silenciata because of its role in the counterculture in British Columbia. And it grew in various pasture lands, agricultural fields, all through the Fraser Valley, in the interior, in the Rocky Mountain Trench, the central Vancouver Island, especially in Haida Gwaii and other coastal areas. It is now diminished greatly. There used to be just numerous fields where these grew abundantly, but agricultural practices have changed, and there aren't the open grazing of cattle the way that they used to be, the way it used to be so prevalent. Now it's mostly in barn, growing up the cattle for either milk or meat. And hay fields are just cut and harvested and not grazed by the cattle the way that they used to be. Or the land's being developed into housing or golf courses, or it's other types of more intensive agriculture. And these Liberty caps are very characteristic mushrooms, and they're considered by many experienced mushroom people to be the most user-friendly of the magic mushrooms. And they're cute too. And it used to be for recreational dose, 1 gram dry weight was the standard recreational dose. This was a 1 gram little baggie that was found at the end of one of our Vancouver Mycological Society mushroom displays, our annual show at Van Dusen Gardens. When we were cleaning up, we found this little baggie under the poisonous mushroom display. And we imagined that somebody had purchased a street dosage of magic mushrooms. So when they saw the displays and the presentations about poisonous mushrooms, they decided it wasn't worth the chance. There were lots of problems when these mushrooms were so popular. Lots of people were eating them. A lot of school kids. Believe it or not, the hippie movement was a youth movement, even though now it's a bunch of old hippies, but still young at heart. But there's so many people eating these, hundreds of thousands, millions even of people that were experimenting with these. There were very few incidents, but there were a few. And there's some very infamous ones, popular press articles about teenagers leaping out of windows under the influence of mushrooms, thinking they could fly, that sort of thing. High press exposure. When I did a 5-year study of mushrooms of Haida Gwaii, and when I was up in the Queen Charlotte Islands, Haida Gwaii, I kept hearing stories about people that had gone nuts, that had freaked out on magic mushrooms. And I was like, oh God, these people really had an issue with this. And then it suddenly occurred to me that it's a small community up there. And it's a strong Haida community. About half the population is Haida. Most of the people are related to each other. I've been hearing about the same person because everybody would tell me about their uncle or their aunt, or their cousin or their brother or their, I kept hearing these stories. Pretty soon I realized, oh, it's just one person. That everybody knew them, of course. So there were lots of high-profile problems. I was very impressed to attend the Halloween party in Haida Gwaii, and they had brownies, psilocybin mushroom brownies, and they were passing them around, and they had this covering them. And the person handing them out would hold this in front of the person, say, you see, a mushroom. You see, these have mushrooms in them. Do you understand? And then he'd make them read it out loud back to him if they could read. And then he would tell them again. And only after they'd agreed 3 times, he'd open it up and let them take a brownie and eat it. So they've learned how to instill a culture of caution and to prevent accidental exposure. I'll get back to a bit of that later. Psilocybe stuntsii is a weed mushroom, very low potency, grows in landscaping and lawns, etc. Often high risk of contamination, being in such urban manicured areas, and high risk of confusing with poisonous mushrooms. They're very drab looking little mushrooms with a ring on the stem. And Psilocybe subfimetaria was a species that was published as a new species. It was first found a few blocks from where I live in near Oak Ridge Mall in Vancouver on an urban lawn. There's in 1974, I believe it was, Gaston Guzman, the world expert on the psilocybin mushrooms, and a bunch of crazy hippies from the US toured up to Vancouver to look for magic mushrooms for Gaston Guzman's monograph on the genus psilocybe. I happened to run into them. A friend of mine ran into this group of funny looking people picking mushrooms, asked them, oh, I know somebody who knows all about that. So they were referred to me, and I dragged them around town looking at magic mushrooms all through Vancouver. And they found this apparent new species growing on an urban lawn in Vancouver. By the way, Gaston Guzman turned to one of the others and spoke for a while in Spanish. And when I asked Dale Leslie what he'd said, Dale said, well, he just said, do these mushrooms grow everywhere in Vancouver? And so I told him, yeah, it looks like they do. And he said, well, how does anybody get anything done here? So at one time, there were impressive numbers of these mushrooms growing all over Vancouver, various types of magic mushrooms. Now, there are deadly mushrooms that look like the magic mushrooms, and these are always of great concern with the wild harvested mushrooms. You might get the wrong mushroom by mistake. This is Galerina cinnamomea, a deadly mushroom that attacks the liver and causes death. It's remarkable the number of people that were picking and eating them, how few serious poisonings resulted. Some of these people were motivated enough to become very skillful identifiers of magic mushrooms. Another picture of the deadly mushroom. And there's a couple of other mushrooms in different genera, groups of mushrooms that also have psilocybin. There's a tiny little one that grows in warm weather and lawns, etc. Canostobe cyanopus, just tiny little things. And they're kind of worrying because they are related to and look somewhat like these deadly Canostobe pilaris, which also have the liver nuking amatoxins, as do Galerina. And they can, by the way, grow even in your home in potted plants, etc. These are little weed mushrooms that will often grow in amongst the magic mushrooms. And Paniola subultiatus is something that hangs out in barnyards and horse stables and very rich landscaping materials incorporating manure. And there's also Gymnophilus aeruginosus that grows on wood, and it's very not all that closely similar to psilocybe species, has a reddish brown spore print. Spore prints can be quite beautiful, by the way, and stains quite blue or green. They have a very colorful mushroom, which led me to try to cultivate it. So I messed around and found that they're very ornamental mushrooms to cultivate. By the way, they have intense bitter taste, so they're not one that most people are happy eating. Now, cultivating mushrooms is interesting because it has now dominated the whole magic mushroom scene. The wild ones are not that much sought after. People traveled around the world and to parts of the world where magic mushroom tourism became big. And Thailand was one of these areas. So this is Koh Samui, I think, one of the Thai islands. And in 1985, there were these little beach huts that were serving up magic mushroom omelets. And they became quite famous. Several beaches had these little magic mushroom omelets. Magic mushroom every day we have. And it turned out that they were serving these omelets even when the mushrooms were not in season. Eventually, there were lots of very bad incidents, and the Thai government cracked down on it. It turned out that they're taking edible mushrooms, lacing them with LSD, PCP, are downright poisons, and adding them to these omelets. And there were incidents of Europeans that went nuts and acted badly. So the whole thing got suppressed. But then it was about the time that Club Meds moved in a big way, and no longer was it backpackers, hitchhikers paradise. It became yuppified, as we say. So lots of people, with the help of the McKenna's book, growing this psilocybin mushroom and other books. Lots of people began to cultivate mushrooms, and they can be grown outdoors in the summer here. Lots of people can have a blast incorporating them into their garden, or growing indoors. This is 1977, one of the early techniques of growing the magic mushrooms indoors. And now the whole scene is pretty much dominated by the cultivated cubensis mushrooms. We were one of the earlier jurisdictions to legalize marijuana. And I was I would regularly go to the cannabis events, the 420 or the Cannabis Day open market festivals in Vancouver to do research, out of academic interest. So I documented what I found very interesting was the incursion of mushrooms into the whole movement to legalize cannabis. So this is 2011, the rally at the courthouse in downtown Vancouver. And signs begin to pop up, people offering shrooms at the 420 thing. They'd throw up their little market stalls and they'd be advertising shrooms. And oddly enough, they always use the spotted Amanita type, Mario type mushroom. It's become now the symbol in the recreational crowd for the magic mushrooms. And as time went by, it seemed to get more and more sophisticated. I found there were some very disconcerting things about this. It was sometimes very hard to get clear whether these were mushroom products they were selling, marijuana products, or both, whether it contained both marijuana and mushroom. They are mostly chocolates, little chocolates made with some mushrooms incorporated into it. And sometimes there'd be no information on the dosage. There was something I found very amusing was a young fellow who had his skateboard with a little mushroom sign taped to the bottom. And he would set up, he put the little skateboard down, he'd be sitting there selling mushrooms. And he got uncomfortable, he'd just flip the skateboard over, hop on it, and skate off to another location. Or he'd pop it under his arm and carry it under his arm so nobody could see the mushroom sign. And then he'd find another spot, lay it out again, and start over again. Thought, wow, this is certainly clever. And it really got quite sophisticated. This is 2017, the year the cannabis became legal. And the whole magic mushroom commercial thing had gotten quite big at that time. I was made very nervous by this because I saw a lot of people getting these things who didn't look sophisticated. They didn't look like they might be knowledgeable about the hallucinogens. In some cases, I saw what looked like older, sort of dodgy street sort of aura men buying handfuls of these and cannabis edible products and giving them to definitely underage kids for what I imagine might be nefarious purposes. I was in touch with, I do a lot of toxicology work with poisonous mushrooms. And so I was checking in with the emergency ward at St. Paul's Hospital, closest hospital to where these events take place. And they said they had a huge influx in the last few years of these events of people presenting not with neurological symptoms, but with gastrointestinal symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. And a lot of these edibles were being prepared in a non-food safe setting and were badly stored and badly displayed and badly packaged. And I was rather amused to see that you could use various modes of payment, different credit cards, even American Express, which isn't always accepted in BC, and to pay for your mushroom chocolates, which are sitting in the sun here. And as a consequence, there are great concerns about quality control with the magic mushroom in edible form. And this is also a great concern with edible cannabis products and just about, it has to be prepared safely as a food as well as an intoxicant. And something I found rather interesting at these events, one of these events, was this appeared to be a group of law enforcement personnel doing field work. I wasn't the only one doing research there. And this was in 2014. But something I noticed, and you may be familiar with the year just before the legislation legalizing cannabis came through, most of the major players, the activists that held these cannabis festivals and were involved with the marijuana party and all of that sort of thing, were busted just within months of the legalization. And what had happened was they were very openly selling. This is the cannabis culture table at that cannabis event. And so the cops are just biding their time, documenting, they're making purchases like this. And then they had lobbied the judiciary to put in a stipulation that nobody with a criminal record could be involved with the legal cannabis industry. So just at the last moment, a lot of these activists were brought up on charges in an attempt to prevent them from being involved with the commercialization of legal cannabis. Okay, so that's a view of the mushrooms, magic mushroom psilocybin containing. I'll just mention that there's the other magic mushroom, Amanita muscaria, which has a totally different chemistry. It's more of an inebriant, not an hallucinogen as such. And it's a totally different subjective effect. They are beautiful, they're iconic, and they are gorgeous. And but I don't recommend them as an intoxicant. And they especially are contraindicated if you are taking any sort of stimulant like coffee, tea, any caffeine, any sort of stimulant is definitely in antagonist, or acts very much against the chemistry, the neurological chemistry of these amanitas. And there is a funny little coincidence, which the Amanita muscaria is generally being called the classic toadstool. And it is now, and here's a bufotenine containing cane toad and Amanita muscaria. They got very interested in looking for these neuroactive compounds in a range of different fungi. And they found that the Amanita porphyria actually contains the toad toxin bufotenine, which in turn is related to serotonin and to psilocybin, being an indole compound. And that is the end of the talk. Great.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. That was amazing. And just wanted, as you mentioned, as mentioned, we're going to take a quick break, like just 3 minutes here, let everyone take a rest, refill their beverage, go to the bathroom, whatever they need to do. And then we'll resume in a moment for the question and answers. So get your hands raised. Get your type any questions to me if you want to be anonymous or are a little shy to talk. You can pop your notes to me. Again, if you want to be anonymous, please let me know in the message, and then we'll get the cues. We'll get the questions queued up in a few minutes when we come back. So we'll see you back here in say 3 or 4 minutes. All right, everyone. So yeah, like I said, we'll start the QA session now. Again, thanks again, Paul, for the awesome talk. Again, if you can raise your hand. I got 2 right now. I got Axel and Ivar ready to go. And yeah, if you have any questions and you want to ask them anonymously, directly message me in the chat. And if you want to be anonymous, please mention that you want to be anonymous. That'll be great. So first up, if you are ready, Axel, I will unmute you and you can go ahead. So I'm going to ask to unmute, and I think you have to accept that unmute, Axel, and then you can go ahead when you're ready.
Thanks, Kenny. And thank you, Paul. Thanks a lot for sharing all that information. Very useful. Of course, thanks a lot for mentioning the space that Mexico has in the resurgence of the use of mushrooms in the West world. I'd like to ask if you have any information on the spiritual or religious use of mushrooms here in British Columbia. maybe by Indigenous or First Nations people. I was able to get a hold of a cool book, Mushrooms of Hawaii. I had a bit of mention of it in there, but not really anything in depth.
Yeah, that is something which is of great interest to us, of course. By the way, that's my book, the Outer Spores, Mushrooms of Hawaii.
Awesome.
And so it's, I've been keeping forever ears open for any indication of traditional spiritual use of the mushrooms in BC. And I would first say that the vast majority of the Pacific Northwest Native communities, peoples, didn't have anything to do with mushrooms at all. They didn't use them as food. They totally disregarded them. In fact, they have very negative connotations. The only peoples that used mushrooms as food were the interior Salish in British Columbia. But there are a couple of tantalizing clues. The Haida and some of the coastal people believe that their ancestors used some type of magic mushroom in ceremonial healing and as an adjunct to ceremonial procedures. But they're very vague on what that mushroom was. And I've only heard it from the younger generation. The elders don't seem to share anything, except there was one individual from Vancouver Island who claimed that her peoples used the psilocybin mushrooms in childbirth, and that the mother in labor would be given a tiny bit of the mushroom to disassociate from the pain of giving birth. The only other thing we have is the use of Amanita muscaria in Northwest Territories, Yukon, and northeastern corner of BC, where the dog rib and some other peoples apparently use the Amanita muscaria in some context. It's not sure if it was religious or ceremonial, spiritual as such, but it appeared that it was used during potlatches or some kind of group activity, but maybe as an intoxicant rather than a sacred sort of sacrament type of thing. Otherwise, there's nothing in the formal ethnological literature about it, and none of the past researchers have found. There's just scattered references to them being used as talismans and having spiritual context as an object, but not for consumption.
Right. There is the mythology of fungus men in Hawaii, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And that, interestingly enough, the Haida did not consider fungus to be fungus. They didn't recognize it. They thought it was a part of the tree. They called it tree ears. And they didn't consider a fungus to be a different organism. They just saw the fungi as being a part of the tree.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Paul. That was a great talk. One of the things that came up was the psilocybin mushrooms growing relatively wild on bark mulch and whatnot, on mulch. I'm wondering if one wanted to foster that kind of growth and help the mushroom spread, where would one find psychedelic or psilocybin strains that would be in a form that would be you could propagate it?
There are places where you can buy the spore prints or the spore solutions in liquid, syringes with the spores in a liquid medium. And doing an internet search, you will find that there are companies selling the magic mushroom spores. There are a couple of, I'm not up on that at the moment, but there are a couple of outfits I understand that make the spawn available. You go from the spores germinating to mycelium, and then that's grown out on grain usually, and then that can be available through certain companies to plant your own. But I don't have at the moment a name of a company, but I think you can find.
Okay. Yeah, no, there's the spores are available. I found a few places, but if we wanted to put it in the birch or in the mulch, would you consider like the spawn? Would that be the right time to put it in, or maybe this is getting...
You would want to somehow have the spawn, and you can start from the spores and do your own onto agar, and then from that onto grain or similar sawdust or some similar substrate, and so make your own spawn. And then that would be usually the way that I would do it would be to generate the spawn in sterile conditions, and then I would autoclave or pasteurize a whole bunch of wood chips at low temperature, straw, mostly pasteurized, and then would inoculate that with the spawn, and then from there go to the outdoor substrate. But you want to remember that our species are seasonal, so the timing is important. So you'd want to have spawn ready to go into your wood chips in the spring, so it has all summer to grow in, and then by autumn, with a bit of luck, you'll have a crop.
That sounds great. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I guess winter, we're still winter, so now would be a good time for those of us who might be interested in such endeavors.
Oh yes, yeah. If you want to get the wood chips and such, a great thing is to get a bit of dialogue going with a tree trimmer, or you can go to the city, what do they call them, work yards. There's a couple of them where they have big piles of the wood chips available for the public to take. So the substrate's free for if you use your imagination.
Awesome. Yeah, on the wood chip tip also, for people in Lower Mainland, there's a company called Get Chip Drop, and if you register your name, arborists will happily just go to the person who's closest and drop off chips. So.
All right. You want to make sure that it's a suitable type of wood chip, a broadleaf tree, not a conifer.
Sorry, what was the best wood chip?
Well, alder is the classic best chip locally available, or for street or domestic trees. The oaks, maple, any of the broadleaf hardwood trees, so-called. But you don't want to have cedar in the mix because that is antifungal. Or pine is also not good.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Excellent. All right, Ivar. I'm going to go ahead and ask I got a couple of anonymous questions here that came in the meantime. So Paul, I'll ask you one of those right now. First one is, do you know if the report by Paul Stamets in his worldwide psilocybin mushroom book that growing mushrooms with extra tryptophan usually increases their psilocybin content, is that correct? With the report by Stamets stating that growing mushrooms with extra tryptophan usually increases their psilocybin content. Are you familiar with that?
It has been assumed that by enriching their substrate with the precursors such as tryptophan, you enhance the production of psilocybin. It's a moot question, though, whether the tryptophan remains intact. The fungi get their food by excreting enzymes into their surroundings. The enzymes break down various compounds, then they're taken back into the fungus mycelium. So I'm not sure if the enzymatic activity of the fungi would retain the tryptophan intact or not. So, but theoretically, when they grow them in artificial media, agar enhanced with tryptophan, they get higher psilocybin production. But I don't know if that would translate into a substrate. And that's something that I was interested in, by the way, at one time, the idea that some grasses, such as reed canary grass, are very high in tryptophan and other indoles. And so I always thought that maybe if you could get reed canary grass straw and grow cubensis in it, it might have an enhancing effect.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for that. Next question here is from Dennis McKenna. Mushrooms and psilocybin have been around a lot longer than humans. Paul, can you speculate about the possible functions of psilocybin in nature?
The functions of it?
Yeah, the possible functions of psilocybin in nature. Dennis, feel free to come on in audio and further clarify or discuss, but that's what he mentioned. Yeah, the possible functions of psilocybin in nature.
I have been extremely impressed with the diversity of compounds that fungi can produce, including some that are downright lethal to most warm-blooded animals, to most mammals. The psilocybin, I sort of enjoy the McKenna idea that perhaps it was something generated to kickstart the primates into evolving human brains, that the pretty blue mushrooms were put in the paths of monkeys to entice them out of the trees. But I don't know, because the fungi just seem to have a hell of a time playing with biochemistry, and it's amazing the enormous number of compounds that are produced by fungi. And I'm a bit hesitant to assign motive to nature. I think a lot of what happens is just hell, it happens. That's just what happens. And perhaps it's the peculiarity is that the primates evolved who had brains that would be affected by the compounds that were already there. We don't know how many other animals are affected by psilocybin, by the way. The lab tests on lab animals are not very informative, I don't think. So anyway, I don't know, Dennis, if, I'd be really hesitant to assign some kind of purpose for things.
He later added on maybe insect interactions.
Oh, that could be, yeah. Even though insects have such little tiny nervous systems, I imagine that, yeah, that could be, yeah. It's a very interesting to speculate whether it could also have something to do, I don't know if cattle or livestock or ruminants are affected by the psilocybin, but it may have just been a great dandy dispersal mechanism by having something that animals would enjoy eating. We do know that there was an incident, and I think it was Scotland years ago, where traffic was disrupted on country roads by sheep having sit-ins on the roads, and somebody had figured out that the sheep were actually seeking out and eating the liberty cap mushrooms in the pastures, and then were for some reason sitting on the roadways, stoned presumably. So it could be a dispersal mechanism.
Absolutely. Anna commented, reindeers do eat Amanita muscaria.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, great, thank you. Next, anonymous question here. I've been reading about microdosing, and the available information can be confusing at times. If you're familiar in the subject, Paul, do you have any pointers or trustworthy authors or guides, if that's something you're familiar with?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of positive claims for microdosing, especially coming from the artistic community or people who use it for sort of mood control or just well-being, sort of sense of well-being. I have a couple of major concerns about it. And one, which I've observed in people that initiated microdosing on their own. And I call it creep and drift. Creep is a sort of dosage creep, where a person will have a little bag of mushrooms and they'll nibble here and they'll nibble there. And then eventually they find that they're taking more and more, because it's not something that, the idea is to be below the subjective neurological effects or subjective effect level. So it just mildly, just barely alters mood. And I've known individuals that kept eating more and more, and pretty soon they were stuffing fistfuls down their throat every day. And then that results in drift, where these individuals also are doing it all the time, and they begin to lose touch with what it is to be not psilocybin. So I cautions would be to only do runs of a certain limited time, microdosing, and then take an equal time or more off. And if you do the microdosing, make sure that you maintain a steady thing. And I personally, my own belief is that the value of true hallucinogens is in a periodic experience which is immersive and which is life-changing. And any chronic ingestion of a substance makes me rather nervous, except coffee and such. I'm guilty of it. Maybe experience speaking when it comes to the caution.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, for anyone interested in microdosing, I will please if you're interested in learning more, our chat room that Christoph mentioned is a good place. We have a resident expert in microdosing, Anna, who's been doing some work in that regard, and some others are very familiar with it. So if you want to get in our chat room, it can be helpful. Or if you want to reach out in the Zoom chat right now, maybe someone can connect you with some help for anyone interested. So definitely just throwing that out there. But our chat room's a great place to get more reliable information on that if anyone is looking for that. Cool. Speaking of Anna, actually, she had a question we're going to ask on her behalf for you, Paul. Can you please let me know, with so many genus of psilocybin mushrooms, how come the psilocybin cubensis are known so much more?
It is primarily for ease of cultivation, and they're global, pan-tropical, subtropical species. Wherever you have sufficient moisture, and the livestock, the cattle that produce the dung that they grow on, or the elephants or whatever dung they're growing on. So they're in Asia, Africa, South America, any tropical, southern North America. And so they're very widespread and very easy to grow. They're one of the easiest mushrooms to cultivate. So it's primarily from ease of cultivation.
Excellent, excellent. That actually kind of transitions well into a question that I had myself that some others might be interested in, which is, if for those interested in growing out there, do you have a type that you would recommend that is kind of easiest to get started with, whether that's indoors or outdoors? Would that be cubensis?
Yeah, I think cubensis, and there's a strain Golden Teacher that's very popular that seems like a good performer. And the cubensis are readily available. Various, mail order outfits can make them available. And the directions and instructions for growing them are readily available. And they're very tolerant. They just want warmth and moisture. And they're a really easy one to grow. And they're large in size too. They're big fleshy mushrooms, and unlike a lot of them, they're little tiny things. So they're quite satisfying to grow.
Excellent, thanks. So I don't have any more questions. Any last call? Anyone want to jump in real quick? Christoph, go right ahead.
I just realized I'm doing this on my phone, so I don't even have access to all the buttons here. I was going to ask Paul just a question. I don't know, Paul, if you know anything about the nomenclature with regards to the strain penis envy, where that even comes from, that name. Is there a story behind that? Or if you know anything about that, just wondering.
Yeah, I just heard recently, I was sort of curious about that. It's sort of a mutant, not a mutant, but a genetic spin-off of cubensis, and it apparently was from Thailand, and somebody had tried growing various wild-derived cubensis from spores, and found that this one particular strain seemed to form these weird mushrooms that didn't develop a full cap. I don't think they totally open up, and they do look rather phallic. So with a sense of humor, they called it penis envy. I think it might be John Allen of Seattle, perhaps, Mushroom John. He might have been the one that found that and spread it around.
Awesome,
Nice.
thank you. It was a very, I guess maybe it's a very suitable name then.
Yeah.
Excellent. Oh, got a couple more questions trickling in. Christoph, you good?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. So another one, are there any places in Vancouver that test for the safety of mushrooms, or that you can to help you verify that you are sure you're growing the right ones?
That you're for the cultivated ones, so you're growing the right ones?
Yeah, I guess, again, to test for safety, I guess if you bought some, you want to test for safety, or whether you're growing or buying, to make sure you're growing the right thing, and then test for safety.
Yeah,
Any
there's no readily available service. I end up through my work with CDC, Drug and Poison Information Center. I identify a lot of mushrooms that come to me from poisoning cases or suspected poisonings or possible exposures of pets or children. And there I may spend hours with a microscope identifying the mushrooms or send them to UBC for DNA analysis. But there are costs involved with that. There isn't a free service. And to screen for safety, you would be talking about verifying that it's the right species. There might be concern with whether there are toxins produced by the fungus in there, or there might be concerns of microbial contamination. And these can pop up with cultivated mushrooms. There have been cases of people that have contaminated mushrooms that are cultivated from the grower themselves or the harvester. Things like, was it the gastrointestinal viruses, that sort of thing.
Nice, nice. Well, so I will mention that I know that there is a testing facility in Vancouver. I assume I'm not sure if they test mushrooms or not. I haven't tried them myself, but getyourdrugstested.com, which is on East Hastings. I'm not sure if they do mushrooms. I know they do other stuff, but if anyone in the chat room knows, they do not test mushrooms, not organic. Sorry. Yeah, so there you go. Let's see, we have one more here. It's a pretty broad question. Do different varieties of psilocybin mushrooms have different effects?
Yes. Like I mentioned in my talk that 3 species, the Azarescens, Biocystis, and cyanescens, tend to cause motor problems, motor control, ataxia. The legs don't work. It's hard to stand up and move around easily. We don't know what causes that. The psilocybin mushrooms can have various compounds. There's psilocybin, psilocin, norbaeocystin, baeocystin, and several other tryptamines and some other things in there. And the quantities vary widely with different mushrooms, different species of the mushrooms, and different individuals of the same species, depending on where they're growing. And sometimes it's being found when they grow the mushrooms that a single crop, when they analyze different mushrooms separately, will have different levels of the compounds in them. So it's all over the place. The quality control is going to be a real issue to use therapeutic clinical approaches using the whole mushroom, because of this great variability in the compounds in the mushroom. It's also subject to breakdown with storage, drying out storage, etc., breakdown with light, air, and temperature. But some of the species are known for being very powerful, such as the cyanescens, Biocystis, and Azarescens, and others are very weak, like the Stuntzii and the Pelliculosa.
Excellent. Okay, next one. Now this one's a little long, so I'll try to ask it nicely. here. Given the long history of mushroom usage among Aztec and Mayan cultures for religious purposes, do you have any idea as to why their practices were inclined towards a sort of violent and rather darker side, opposite to our mushroom ideas about shroom spiritual potentiality, which is more towards the light and benevolence?
Yeah, the Aztec culture, by all accounts, was extremely violent. It was based on sacrifice. A lot of the chronic warfare in Mesoamerica was based on gathering prisoners for human sacrifice. And the whole culture was extremely warlike and very, very a good match for the Spaniards, who were also rather warlike and with lots of ghoulish religious practices. So it's a very cultural thing. And I like to think of it as if you were to take a psychopathic asshole and give them an hallucinogen, you would just have a stoned psychopathic asshole. It's not going to change them into an angel. So it's all very cultural. So I think that I think the potential of too often people assume that there's some miraculous activity of the psilocybin that nurtures just the best part of our spirit, but it can nurture the evil side too. So, Charles Manson and the gang are a good example of hallucinogens being bent to the dark side. It's a truth,
right.
not to.
No, that's great. And so no LSD in the water supply. Got it.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see, got a couple more here coming in. Keep flowing in. Again, please, if you want to ask audio, you can still raise your hand. Okay, how's the Vancouver Mycology Club managing through COVID? Can we look forward to any group tours happening anytime soon? I do know our own group is looking to organize something as soon as we possibly can, just for anyone, keep your eye on the meetup apps. But yeah, Paul, how's the club doing, and what's the plans here as we go into the summer?
We are pretty much into dormancy at the moment. We have been having Zoom meetings and presentations periodically. Our website has information on that, vanmyco.com. But otherwise, we have taken a year of hiatus. We're just beginning to get things together now. Our club was largely based on sort of group activity, and so it's been very tough to come up with suitable activities. So we basically just took a year of downtime, and now we're hoping to get up and running. And I'm thinking of perhaps having very low, small scale urban walks eventually, if the pandemic situation eases up a bit, if enough people have been vaccinated or inoculated or whatever, we might be having very low scale, small group walks, but the logistics haven't been figured out yet.
Excellent news. Okay, a couple more trickling in here. Okay, so mushrooms are famous for establishing a symbiotic relationship with other species. Do you think the relationship between psilocybin mushrooms and humans have traits of a symbiotic relationship?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have created a symbiotic relationship there. And so I think you could call it a symbiosis of a sort. But I don't know how obligatory something must be to be called a symbiosis, because we don't need the psilocybin mushrooms. We probably are doing better since they were found. And the mushrooms probably don't need us, even though they seem to thrive with the help of humans. But there doesn't seem to be a dependency there.
Cool, thanks. All right, another one here. Do you know of any history of tryptamine isolation or synthesis other than psilocybin?
Well, yes, there is the psilocin, psilocybin, baeocystin, norbaeocystin have all been, isolated from psilocybe mushrooms. I think the psilocin and psilocybin have been readily synthesized. I don't know if, I think the baeocystin, norbaeocystin, one or the other has been successfully synthesized in some degree of efficiency, but and then there are various other tryptamines that are found in the mushrooms too. Everything from the serotonin type, the usual suspects, to some ones which I just recently have found out about, and I can't recall the names.
All right, great, thank you. Got one more left. Last shot, everyone. Get your last questions in. Last one here is a local question from someone. Looks like they're joining us from Ireland. Do you know the species of psilocybe most commonly found in Ireland?
Yeah, that is a psilocybe semilanceata, and it's very common in Ireland. It grows in the grasses, green grasses, in the deep thatch, the thick thatch of the dead grass roots that are, so a wet field. They love wet fields, which Ireland has an abundance of. And it's, I've heard that some parts of Ireland where they have active grazing pastures are very dense with the Liberty taps, the psilocybe semilanceata.
Well, I, for one, will not try to spell that, but thank you. All right, that's all the questions we have. So, Christoph, hand it back to you for any closing words. Thanks for all the questions, and Paul, thank you for the answers.
Oh,
Awesome.
Made sense.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Paul. I want to thank you for coming out and joining us for this and giving that insightful talk. I've learned a lot, and I think that was really engaging with all the questions and everything. And you've just got this wealth of knowledge and everything, and I really appreciate you coming on here. I also want to give a thanks to everyone else for joining us and for just being part of this. So thank you for coming here, and as well, thank you to Ken for doing the moderation. So. From here, I think what we'll do is, I guess, Ken, if you want to just give a couple words on the breakout sessions.